Welcome to the Great War Discussion Group. Our speaker this month is Mike Burke, who is going to give us an outline of World War I in Sub-Saharan Africa. Many people feel that Germany had acquired sort of an inferiority complex because they came to the scramble for Africa quite late. But they did have 4 colonies in Africa, and it became a priority of the Allies to take those back from Germany with the idea that they would take them back on a permanent basis. And they actually did accomplish that eventually. But the path to that objective was somewhat long and tortuous. So Mike Burke is known to all of us as a very active volunteer and has given these talks before. No further ado, Mike, you're on.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Charlie. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's afternoon's discussion. Just as a reminder, I'm really just going to focus on Germany's 4 colonies. I'm not going to talk about the Britain and Egypt and moving up into the Middle East, nor will I talk about all of the Africans who traveled to France to support France. That presentation about African support to France, that'll occur in August. So I decided to break this up into some smaller bite-sized chunks. I asked Lindsay, and I think she provided a handout, so there should be some maps which you can use as I go through and talk about the various colonies. And there also should be a list of my sources, and there's quite a bit. Charlie and I were talking before we started, and if you start looking around and hunting for it, there are actually quite a lot or many sources writing about the war in Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa. So if you're interested, that's provided for you with my attachments. I wanted to talk about this subject for 3 reasons. The first is that I have 10 years experience working security issues in Africa when I worked in the Department of Defense, and then later when I worked in the Department of State. Second, as many of you know, I taught here at the Command and General Staff College for the last 12 years, and I was one of 2 Africanists in my department. So I had the opportunity to introduce quite a few American students to the continent. So it remained an area of interest. And the third reason, and not really bad-mouthing the organization, bad-mouthing the museum, is quite frankly, there really isn't that much about Africa displayed in our museum. It really, to my opinion, it really is kind of Euro-focused. So hence the reasons why I wanted to go ahead and talk about that. So with that introduction, let me go ahead and talk about transition to the next. This is kind of the outline that I'm going to follow. And if you look at the picture in the bottom right-hand corner, yes, that is a horse that has been painted to look like a zebra. If you know a lot about Africa or anything about Africa, you know that there are a lot of diseases that were, that affected both the Europeans as well as animals. And so while in Europe, a lot of things are moved by a train, they're moved by truck, they're moved by pack animals. In Africa, because horses were susceptible to sleeping sickness, most of the horses died. And so obviously the British officer here wanted to ensure that his horse was protected. And so he went ahead and painted it as a zebra. So I kind of thought that was kind of interesting. Who are these 2 soldiers? That is correct. The gentleman on the right is Lieutenant Colonel Paul von Ludwig Vorbeck. He was the German commander in German East Africa. And the soldier on the right is Regimental Sergeant Major Alhaji Grunishi. And Grunishi is credited with firing the first land shot, or the first shot between soldiers in the First World War. And that occurs during the conquest of the first German colony. And so, my wife wanted to know, why did I pick these 2 particular soldiers? And to be honest with you, for me, they are the alpha and the omega of conflict in Sub-Saharan Africa. The soldier who fired the first shot in anger, and the leader who essentially led the last offensive operation at the end of the war. And so that's why I did it. So very good. So that kind of worked out well. Good. We'll do that a couple more as we go along. Right. So let me talk a little bit about where you can see Africa mentioned in the museum. And it's really in a couple of places. The first one is in the introductory film, specifically during the section that talks about empires. There's a video of what I believe to be Africans working on a railroad line, and I believe that might be from the Congo, the Belgian Congo, the Free State. That looks a lot like photographs I've seen in other sources. So there's that discussion about Africa and in the video. Then the rest of it, for the most part, is in the our global war gallery. And so you come in, you take a look at the photograph. Everybody's looked at it. You got the map down here in the lower right-hand corner, and it shows the 4 German colonies and the fighting there. If you go further into the gallery, you look up to the left, you've got those still photographs. And so you've got the 1st Machine Gun Company from the British. These are British soldiers or African soldiers fighting the Brits. They're from the Gold Coast. And these are Algerian light cavalry that were deployed to Paris at the beginning of the war. And here they're marching through Paris, being received by the Parisians. So you got those 2 photographs. If you remember also, with these still photographs, there's moving photographs between them. And in those moving photographs, you have these 2. Plus, you also have more North African soldiers. You have 1 Sub-Saharan African soldier with ritual face scarring. But those are the photographs. And then if you look at the timeline, Africa is mentioned 3 times in the timeline. And I'll address those as we kind of go through the presentation. So that's I think to me, that's the most ready available or most visible aspects of Africa. And then we've got the two glass display cases to the left, right? And so that first case essentially has the discussion of the African front, talks about the 4 colonies, talks about the Allies' efforts, and then how the war ends in Africa, essentially 14 days after the armistice is signed in Europe. A map again of the 4 German colonies, photographs of some African soldiers, and then a comment or a quote from an African soldier. You've got this report on how the Germans treated the British prisoners of war, their natives. And then you have the spa jacket of the light cavalry officer or the light cavalry soldiers uniform coat. And then just to the display case left to it, you've got the map up above that shows what the British Empire, where the British Empire was fighting during the First World War. And then you've got the South African kilt. And it was kind of interesting as I was doing the research that the bulk of the soldiers fighting in Sub-Saharan Africa for the Brits really will be South African soldiers. Yes, there'll be British soldiers. Yes, there'll be Indian soldiers. Yes, there'll be Africans from the English colonies. But most of the white soldiers, white officers are going to be South Africans. That was something that I did not really know before I took a quick look at the subject. And then, not to be forgotten, is a lot of these weapons that we see on the case coming into this particular gallery. Europeans, the colonial masters, though I'm not supposed to say that in some context, but the Europeans did not want to give their soldiers the most modern weapons. And why was that? Well, essentially because there were a lot of revolts and rebellions by Africans against their colonial overseers. And so why give them the most modern rifle, pistol, or machine gun? Most of those modern weapons that you see on the Western Front, those were kept with the European soldiers, and the Africans essentially got the older weapons. Most of the German African soldiers carried weapons that still use black powder, and so they were very, very visible on the battlefield. So anyway, so that I think covers where the Africa is discussed in the museum. I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't talk a little bit about Africa in general. I know that when I first was assigned to the headquarters responsible for Africa, I knew where it was, and that was about it. And so I'm going to assume that you knew much more about Africa than what I do, but I still want to go ahead and provide a little bit of historical and a little bit of context for Africa. So here comes your second question. Again, if you could use the chat function, I would appreciate it. So quickly type in the first word that comes to mind when you hear or you read Africa. All right, so what do we got? Huge. Exactly, Africa is extremely large. It is the second largest continent. Kenya, a lot of people think of Kenya, I think, because Pamela served in Kenya when she a little while ago. Richard talked about Toto, so he had this, you had the song out of, the song of Africa, and then Jerry talked about colonial. So yeah, exactly, all good points. I mean, the history of Africa really does encompass all of that. So very good. Thank you very much. All right. So as we all know, Africa is the birthplace of mankind. If you get a chance to go to Tanzania, or you go to Kenya, you go to the Olduvai Gorge, and you can trace the oldest relics or finds of humankind are actually found there. And then, when I was a kid growing up, we talked about the cradle of civilization or the Fertile Crescent that stretched from Egypt all the way up into the Middle East. And so as I was researching this, some folks also say that there were additional cradles of civilization, one in Asia and then one in Latin America. But for me, I'll stick with the fact that civilization, as we kind of know, it begins in Egypt and stretches up through the Middle East. The other thing I think a lot of people may not be familiar with is that, long before the Europeans came to Africa, which really isn't until the 14th century, there were very large African kingdoms that existed in Africa. West Africa, this one shows that many of the ones in West Africa. It shows some of the ones in Central Africa. And so Africa has a long history of kingdoms and empires with rulers and governments and militaries and trade and security forces, again, long before the Europeans ever showed up. This next slide begins to talk a little bit about Europeans. And for the most part, again, until the 18th or 19th century, most of the Europeans are really just interested in going to Asia. And so they're going to sail around Africa. They're going to identify some of the better ports. And then they're just going to stop in there for water, for fresh food, vegetables. And then they're going to go ahead and head further east, heading off to Asia. North Africa will be explored by everybody who has access to the Mediterranean, from the Phoenicians and the Greeks to the Arabs as well. And then the eastern part of Africa will be essentially also explored by trademen or explorers coming out of Indonesia and India, who know that when the winds blow, the 6 months of the year when the winds blow to the west, they can travel down the eastern coast. And then when it comes time when the trade winds change for the second 6 months, they'll go ahead and make their way back to India or Indonesia. So again, it's really not until later 17th or 1800s, 19th century before the Europeans start getting interested into the interior of Africa. And of course, one of the other reasons is the diseases that exist in Africa. The Europeans were completely unprepared for them. Of course, the backside of that is that the diseases that Europeans brought to the Africans, they were completely unprepared for. But that, of course, that's a whole other story. All right. So again, you have what as Charlie mentioned it, we have it's called the scramble for Africa. So initially, Portugal's got some colonies, Spain has got some colonies, France begins to look at a couple of colonies, England begins to have some colonies, as Belgium, which comes to King Leopold starts looking for colonies, and so they convince they get involved in for the scramble for Africa. And there are a lot of different reasons for the scramble. There's imperialism. They want to go ahead and expand the empire. They all need natural resources for their industrialization. They need a place to sell their products that they're making. Religious groups are interested in bringing religion to Africa. a sense of nationalism, a sense of exploration. And so quite frankly, there's a whole lot of folks that are beginning to pay their attention to Africa. And so Bismarck in 1844 calls what's called the Berlin Conference, at which point, of course, there are no Africans invited to the Berlin Conference. Unfortunately, they're just all sorts of Europeans. Of note, America will participate, but America is an observer. So we're not actually involved in making any decisions for that. But what happens over that period of time is that, looking at this big blank, if you can see it with my arrow on the left of my illustration, you got this big blank map of Africa. What the Europeans start doing is carving up the continent and putting a name, putting a European name on it. One of the tough things or the interesting things about that is these lines, most of these folks sitting at the table have never been to Africa. And so they're just drawing a line on the map. They don't care that that arbitrary territorial border between, let's say, Senegal and the Gambia cuts one ethnic group into two separate ethnic groups. They don't really care about that. All they really care about is the fact that we now have a country that essentially belongs to them. Obviously, Bismarck is also kind of ridiculed. This is a French caricature about how he's essentially looked at Africa and he's carved it into various little slices for each of the countries sitting around the table. Let me pause a little bit to catch up with my notes. And so this conference produces what's called the Congo Act of 1885, which essentially is the first time that they used the term spheres of influence, where the Europeans now have spheres of influence on the African continent. And then this Congo Act is also going to be used later on at the beginning of the war, mostly by the German governors in an ill-fated attempt to limit the amount of combat that occurs in the German colonies. And so, again, Africa is kind of carved up, and stages are basically set for the conflict of the war to begin in 1914. I have another slide. This next slide is to talk a little bit about the geography. Again, to kind of set the context for what happens. And so, as we've talked about, Africa is the second largest continent. I think you should have a map that was published that shows you how many Asias, how many Europes, how many United States can actually fit into in Africa. The trip from Senegal to Ethiopia is about the same distance as a flight from Chicago to Moscow, and the distance from north to south is about the same flight from Chicago to Hawaii. And so, if you've ever made those flights, you can talk about how long that distance is. The other interesting thing is that with the bankruptcy of Air Afrique, there is no African airline, so only European airlines service Africa. So I once was in South Africa and I needed to go to Senegal. And so I flew back to Paris, spent 24 hours in Paris, which I'm not complaining, it was a great time. But then to go back, so to get into and out of Africa, you really have to end up flying back to Europe. That's where the European air handlers are. The Sahara, which stretches from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Red Sea, is the largest desert. As it says out here, if you're lucky, the Sahara Desert may get 4 inches of rain in a year. So it's extremely, extremely dry. And even saying that, there are people who live in the Sahara. There are nomadic tribes, herdsmen, who move back and forth across the Sahara, searching for, knowing where the water is, but moving their camels and their herds in order to take care of that. It's the hottest continent, again, with the Sahara Desert at 100 plus, and it's very hot and humid. The line here in the center is the equator. Obviously, all those countries that sit aside the equator are hot and humid all year long. That's why you see the next bullet, you get 78 inches of rain in Gabon, the 2 republics of the Congo, because when it's summertime in the north, it's raining, and then when it's summertime in the south, it's raining. And so obviously those countries are going to get, like I said, up to 78 inches of rain in the year, which of course we're going to play havoc on communications infrastructure and all of that. Large coastline, but quite frankly, not very many deep water ports. The other issue is that, and I don't have a slide for it, is that in America, we had the two mountain ranges, you got the Appalachians and the Rockies, which essentially the water flows down from those mountain ranges to the ocean almost unimpeded. So in America, exploration in America, you could get into a port on the East Coast and you could sail all the way up the river as far as you could get. Africa is more, I often describe it as a pool table with 6 pockets or 6 basins. And so, for instance, the longest river in Africa is the Congo River that runs over here. It flows out just south of Gabon. You cannot navigate that river from the Atlantic Ocean into the interior. You go about 100 miles and you run into that escarpment. And so exploration into the interior of the continent had to be done overland and not using the water to do that. Railroads, so essentially, again, these were colonies that were for needed for natural resources. And so there'd be a port and a very short rail line that may go to the nearest sugarcane field or wherever the local minerals were. So there's a little bit of railroads, and there's really not a whole lot of paved roads. I mean, you see the bullet down there. They had less than 3,600 kilometers of roads now, where they've got over a lot. So essentially, the continent is really going to set the stage for how these battles are and how these conflicts are going to be fought. Again, without roads, without railroads, without navigable rivers, everything that these armies are going to need will have to be carried on the backs of porters. And so men, women, and children are going to be drafted as porters. And to be honest with you, quite frankly, most of the military really didn't care what happened to the porters. Porter falls out because he's been shot or wounded, or he's ill. No problem. They go to the next village. They grab a bunch of people and they start. They impress them into the military. How long were these columns? Because most of the militaries marched in columns. In East Africa, one of the British columns had over 8,000 porters and stretched for over 7 miles, single file moving through the bush. And so, again, everything that you see is going to be ported in. I thought it was kind of interesting. The Belgian officers are going to have 18 porters for every single European soldier. So the European soldier didn't take care of anything. His uniform was clean for him, his food was clean for him, his ammunition was clean for him, but they would have up to 18, and then the Germans actually had up to 8. And then Lieutenant Colonel von Borbeck had actually later on in the war had to tell his officers that he could only have, or his soldiers, they could only have 4 porters, and that they would have to suffer, and that caused a lot of grumbling among the German troops. So again, continent, very big, very large, hard to get around. Whereas in Europe, the war is essentially a battle of inches and feet. In Africa, the battles will be over hundreds of miles, but without the transportation infrastructure in order to go ahead and cover it. So this is, again, Berlin Conference. Essentially, this is how Africa looks in 1914. Sorry, I was going to ask a question, but in the effort to go ahead and move on, I will not answer that. Ask that question. All right. So that's that. Essentially, most of the territory: England, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy. Portugal has probably about 3%. They've got three major colonies: Mozambique, Angola, and then up here on the coast. Charlie's already talked about it. There are 4 German colonies, and this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to briefly go over Togoland, Cameroon, and Southwest Africa. I'm going to spend the bulk of the remaining time on East Africa. Some of the terms that I may use: the Schutztruppe is what the Germans called their security forces. And so generally, mostly they are Africans with a handful of German officers or NCOs. They could be military or they could be police. But the general term is Schutztruppe. Germans called their African soldiers Askari, and so you'll see that. Bulamatari is what the Belgians call their African soldiers. And then the Trillier Senegalese is, or what the West Africans or the Senegalese, that was how they were referred to as when they were talking about their soldiers. I mentioned the Berlin Conference, or the act, or the agreement that was signed in 1885. And so when the war begins, each German governor assumes that one of the conditions of that Congo Act was that these colonies were neutral. And so the German governors all essentially told their British and French counterparts, hey, look, the 1885 Act says we're neutral. So we're not going to invade the Gold Coast. We're not going to invade Nigeria. We won't invade French Guinea. The Allies essentially said, screw you, we're going to go ahead and attack anyway. And so initially the Germans are less inclined to want to, or the German diplomats are less inclined to want to go ahead and to fight. So Togoland, first up. Oh, wait, got a quiz. So I gave you the answer, then I gave you the question. So what colony did Sergeant Major Gershini show up? And he comes from the Gold Coast. I guess the extra question would be, what is that colony called today? That is correct. It is Ghana. All right. I have a message from Pamela. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can go ahead and make it a little bit, try to get the words a little bit easier to see. All right. So Togoland, I think Charlie talked about wireless stations and the importance of wireless stations in a previous discussion. And so the wireless, or the funk station, as they called it in Kamina, was really the #1 objective of the British and the French forces. Essentially, the Brits told the governor in Togo, and there were no German military forces. There were only German policemen here. And so they said, look, we want you to surrender. If not, we're going to invade. The British come in from the west. The French come in from the east. Lomé is captured by the 8th of August. And by the 27th of August, the funk station, the wireless station, is captured by Allied forces. I was able to find a postcard. Upper left shows you what the funk station or the wireless station looked like when it was operational. And the buildings still exist. And this is from a guy who bicycled across West Africa. And the building is still there. You probably rent it for a little price. But essentially, Togoland falls very quickly. Cameroon, slightly east of Togoland. Same situation. The governor feels that we are not going to go ahead and fight. We are neutral. Unfortunately, Cameroon is completely surrounded on all three sides by the Allies. You've got the English in Nigeria and the ocean. You have the French over here in the east. And then you've got the Belgians down here in the Belgian Congo. And so they will invade again in August of 1914. Their goal is to seize the port and the capital of Douala, and also to inactivate the shortwave radio station. Conflict in Cameroon is going to last a little bit longer because Cameroon is a little bit closer to the equator. And so its terrain, as that last bullet says, the Germans essentially give up the cities. They move into the hinterland, and the Allies have to start chasing the Germans across the country. So a photograph of a German policeman or a German officer and his soldiers, and then a shot here in the lower left that kind of give you an idea of what the terrain, again, that you had to walk from point A to point B, all your food, all your supplies, everything was carried on the back of porters. So again, Cameroon lasts about not quite a year and a half. Third colony is Southwest Africa. Present-day Namibia is what it's called now. Again, the Allied objectives were the ports and the radio stations in these two cities, and then the capital, which is Windhoek. The German general here was a little bit more offensive in nature. He actually attacked across the border into South Africa, which caused the South Africans to kind of sit back on their heels a little bit. And then about the time that the South Africans were ready to attack into Southwest Africa, there was a Zulu uprising. So the South African army had to pull back into South Africa, put down the uprising, and then go ahead and turn towards capturing German Southwest Africa. And so essentially there'll be two columns that come, And in a short period of time, July of 1915, German forces in Southwest Africa are defeated. Photograph of South African soldiers traveling across the Kalahari Desert, and then another view of the Kalahari today. If you ever get a chance to travel and you want to go ahead and look at a nice desert, there are some good safaris in the Kalahari, get to South Africa, then into Namibia. This will be, as my last point here says, this will be the first truce, or the first occupation of a German colony by something other than British forces, right? So the South Africans essentially are going to move into Southwest Africa. And to be honest with you, they stay there in control of Southwest Africa until the apartheid government falls and independence is given to Namibia to they become their own separate country. So essentially, for the first three colonies, the war is over by July of 1915. Allies occupy all of that. All of the German forces are captured and placed into camps. And so really then we can go ahead and kind of focus our attention to Lieutenant Colonel Paul von Lettow Lorbeck. I'm going to call him VLV, just for shorthand. And how he successfully takes the fight to the Allies from August of 1914 until November of 1918. So coming up on the next quiz question. Thoughts about where did he serve, again, where did he surrender his forces? It is actually Zambia, or then it was called Northern Rhodesia. But yeah, he actually surrenders his forces in Zambia. He will eventually return to German East Africa, which is present-day Tanzania, where he'll march to Dar es Salaam and get on a boat to sail back to Germany. But again, he's moving as fast as he can to get away from the British and so he's going to end up finding himself in Zambia at the end of the war. All right, so let's talk about Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. So good Prussian officer, comes from good Prussian family. He goes into the family business. He joins the army, goes to the imperial colleges. He is a successful commander in the Boxer Rebellion that occurs in China. Successful command there. In 1904, he is sent to Africa. He's sent to Southwest Africa. And he's placed in charge of the cavalry unit that essentially is committing a genocide against the natives of Namibia. Now, while genocide doesn't become an official term until 1947, most historians look at what the Germans did to the people of Namibia and say that was flat out genocide. Now, again, he's placed in charge of German forces after the German commander is relieved for atrocities against the natives, and then that's kind of where he makes his name in Africa. So one of which being the Lion of Africa. Of course, German diplomats in German East Africa actually called him the Mad Bulla because he was very offensive in nature, and the German the German governor in East Africa, von Schnee, was very passive. He wanted to go ahead and essentially say, again, that act, we're neutral, don't attack us. He survives the war. He goes back to Germany. He becomes a military commander. He's elected to the Reichstag. The Nazis attempt to use him as a symbol. He distanced himself from the Nazis, survives the war, and as you can see, he lives until 1964. And he's actually written a biography of his effort in the war as well, which I did not read. I did read the abstract. I thought was an interesting read. A little bit about East Africa. So East Africa, the East African colony, is essentially twice the size of Germany at the beginning of the war. And so it is a very large space. There are 9 African nations in this area. So essentially it's being fought over a very large area. Got 2 big ports, one in Mozambique, one in Dar es Salaam, one railway line that runs from Dar es Salaam up here into the center. There's another railway line, if you can see my arrow, that goes up here. You got Lake Victoria, Tanganyika, and Nyasa, a lot of rivers crisscrossing this, but that is the battlefield that the Allies are going to fight VLV across for almost 4 years. Again, throw in a couple of pictures. These are Askaris. These are German East African soldiers that are maneuvering against the British forces in November of 1914 in the Battle of Tanga. And then this is a photograph of, again, some of those porters carrying all of the supplies. And this is for the Kenyan rifles that are coming out of Kenya. They're marching. This is actually them crossing into Portuguese East Africa later in the war. The war in Africa, the war in East Africa, again, the Foreign Office or the diplomats believed that they were going to be neutral, they could sit out the war. The German military, the headquarters in Europe, quite frankly, all they were focused on was beating France and then turning their armies to beat Russia. So they really didn't care what happened. There was no guidance from the Kaiser as to what to do, what the German colonies were supposed to do, what they were supposed to do in East Africa. Whereas with the British government and the French government, the militaries, again, military leaders didn't really care about what went on in the colonies, but it was the Foreign Office who essentially wanted the soldiers to attack the German colonies. So there really is no German policy for what to do when the war begins, because quite frankly, as you know, the Kaiser made all decisions and nobody wanted to ask the question because nobody really wanted to hear his answer. And so von Schnee, the governor of the colony, he reaches out to the British and the Belgian governors and says, hey, look, I'll let you into Dar es Salaam. I'll let you into the East Coast. Just don't attack us. And VLV essentially says that's not the way I want to do it. And he's actually going to go ahead, disobey orders, and begin attacking into Allied colonies. Which kind of makes for an interesting thought. Von Schnee, as von Lettow-Warbeck is moving around Germany, von Schnee is following him. He's part of the unit that's moving around. And so von Schnee is with VLV at the end, and then writes this really nasty letter back to the new German government saying, we could have done a lot better without the military component of the war. I can only imagine what the discussions over the campfire during the campaign when they were marching back and forth across Germany, East Africa, trying to figure out who was going to do what. And essentially, there'll be about 1.5 million Africans used as porters during the war. And in my conclusion slide, I'm going to talk about how a lot of them fared. This photograph, again, I like photographs. I found a lot. This is Askari marching through Dar es Salaam prior to the start of the war. And then this one is interesting, and I think the right might be skewed a little bit, so let me talk through it. So these are two Askari or German East African soldiers. This is a German army officer. He's a field artilleryman for all your field artillery types. He's going ahead. And if you see over here, he's in a Navy jumper. And so this is a naval gunnery officer, a gunner. And so essentially what happened is that the one German warship that was sailing in the East India, or in the Indian Ocean, they took all of the 105 guns off of that Navy ship before it was scuttled, and they moved all those guns inland, where they were additional artillery for VLV and his forces. And so I thought this was an interesting photograph. All right, so let's kind of get into the action. So there are a couple of firsts that occur in Africa. I've already mentioned the first shot fired in anger after the assassination of the Archduke occurs in Togoland. The first British ship is sunk by that German warship that I talked about, the SMS Königsberg. The first German ship captured by the Brits occurs here on Lake Tanganyika. There was a reinforced little gunboat that the Germans and the British had. The British commander and the German commander of the ships were drinking buddies. And essentially their job was to enforce the anti-slavery law along Lake Tanganyika. So the story goes that the German captain of the ship was out drinking late one night, didn't get the word that the war had started. And so the British commander sailed down, captured him while he was drunk, took possession of his ship, and then invited him back to the British ship where they drank and cursed about how bad the war was turning out for them. So again, that was kind of an interesting story. Again, I talked about DLV is offensive in nature, and he's going to go ahead and start attacking into Allied colonies. And so after the British shell the capital of Dar es Salaam, DLV goes ahead and starts his action. So he's going to go ahead and attack into British East Africa, and he seizes Tabita, which is a communications hub. There's a very good road that comes through there, and there are rail lines that come there. So now he's essentially cut off resupply from Mombasa into the western part of British East Africa. He seizes the city down here in Portuguese East Africa. Again, it's a commercial hub. He's now interdicting the flow of supplies that are coming into Portugal. He sees Morani, which is closer to Mombasa. So now he's putting pressure on the British forces in Mombasa, threatening the port there. Essentially, the Allies are like, well, we've got to do something, especially since he begins attacking into the Belgian colonies, into the British forces here in northern Rhodesia, and again, back into Portugal. And so essentially what the British decide to do is that they're going to invade, or they're going to launch an attack in November of 1914. And so it's essentially occurs here in the northeastern part of German East Africa. Indian soldiers from India are going to board ships and sail their way to Africa. British forces, British military forces under the governor there are going to attack. The two commanders refused to communicate to each other. Von Lettow-Lorbeck was able to dig his position into the city, and so he soundly defeats the first Allied attack into German East Africa, essentially sends the Allies packing. Prior to this Battle of Tanga, the war was being essentially fought through the foreign ministry. After the defeat at Tanga, the British Army is going to take responsibility for this. They're going to kick the Foreign Office out of control for what goes on, and it's going to be led. Military operations will be led by military officers, as opposed to career diplomats. 1915, on the ground, 1915 kind of grounds to a halt. Everybody wants everybody. The Allies, the Germans, they want to establish their positions. They want to go ahead and resupply. And so there's really not a lot of ground combat that occurs on the ground in 1915. However, 1915, 1916, the Allies think that really what they need to do is they need to cut off resupply to VLV. So the Allies already control Lake Victoria, they already control Lake Tanganyika. There is a problem with, they do not control the Lake Nyasa down here. And then there's a problem with the Koningsberg that is sailing up and down the coast, shooting at British shipping. And so the first thing that the Allies are going to do is they're going to seize Mafia Island, which sits off the entranceway to the Rufiji River. And that was really the base of operations for the Koningsberg. Seizing that meant that they were going to be able to go ahead and keep an eye on the entranceway out of the Delta, so that anytime that the German ship came out, they'd be able to see it. Eventually, they tracked down the Koningsberg using aircraft as well as smaller naval ships. They trapped the Koningsberg in the Delta where it can't get out. And eventually, on the 11th of July, the Koningsberg will be scuttled. As I mentioned, all the artillery off that warship will be carried inland. All of the sailors will march in, and they will all become infantry working with VLV. And then later and then by the middle part of 2016, the German reinforced, well, it's really mostly, it was a I want to say tourist ship, but it was really a trade ship that had been reinforced with artillery. That is actually captured, or it's attacked by a British flotilla. And so by at least the middle part of 1916, the Allies control the Indian Ocean, and they control all of the lake system, so that the only way that Germany can get resupplied is through the Portuguese ports, because Portugal doesn't declare a war against Germany. Germany doesn't declare a war against Portugal until March of 16. So German vessels can't come into Dar es Salaam, but German vessels can put into neutral Portugal. The shipments are offloaded, then they're put on porters, and porters carry them all the way back up. So essentially, Germany is being resupplied through Portugal up until the March of 1916. there is an interesting story. I'm not going to talk about it today, but the Brits decided that they needed to do something about the goats in Lake Tanganyika. So essentially, they take two 40-foot boats. They call them Dog and Cat, and they move these two 40-foot boats from England all the way to the lake. And there's an entire book written just about how those two boats made their way to go ahead into Lake Tanganyika. All right. I talked about Lieutenant Colonel von Lotto Vorbeck, but he also faces a couple of Allied officers that are worth noting. And so Jan Smuts, later becomes Prime Minister in South Africa, but in early 1917, he's selected as he's selected as the Allied commander of all Allied forces in Eastern Africa. Interesting, because he was a Boer, and he fought against the British during the Boer War. But he was a very successful field commander. He was politically connected, and so essentially he's given command of all of the Allied forces in German East Africa, and he will lead them for about a year, about 11 months, I think. Next one to talk about is Edward Northey. He's a career British Army officer, a successful commander on the Western Front. He commands a battalion at the beginning of the war, where he's injured. He comes back to command a regiment. He's injured. Upon recovering from his wounds, he's selected to be the commander of Allied forces in the Asa, which is present-day Malawi. And so he'll report to the General Smuts, but he will command all of those forces down there. And then the last one, which is kind of interesting, is Alvaro del Castro. He's actually the governor, as it says here on the slide. If you know anything about the Portuguese history from that time frame, there was a series of overthrows of the government. And so the government is extremely weak. And so I think somewhere in my notes, between 1910 and 1925, they had 45 different governments. Some of the governments liked the military. Some of the governments didn't like the military. Money came to the military. Money didn't go to the military. So essentially, the decisions about how the war was going to be fought in Portugal, Portuguese East Africa, is made by this gentleman here. Eventually, they will send Portuguese forces. They'll send a Portuguese general named the Rosario. But this guy here is really going to end up making a lot of the decisions for how the Portuguese fight the later part of the battles in East Africa. So we'll go back. We took care of what happened on land. Or on sea, sorry. We'll go back to what happens in East Africa. So this is animated, so I'll kind of just briefly talk about it. As it says here, General Smuts lands in Mombasa, which unfortunately is right behind everybody's face. Plans were already in effect for offensive operations, and so within 2 months, he launches attack against German forces who are dug in around Mount Kilimanjaro. And so they actually make a little headway. VLV's fairly successful, but eventually the South African cavalry turns his flank, and so he's faced with being overrun or being flanked, and so he decides to go ahead and withdraw. So he withdraws his forces away from the two British columns and moves his way southeast. All of this next step then from German or British East Africa, from Belgian Congo, and up here out in the Assaland, Allied forces will attack into German East Africa, essentially trying to capture or pin VLV somewhere in this area. He successfully evades these folks. He moves down here into the southern part of the German East African colony. British, again, move to attack him, and he moves here into the southern part of German East Africa colony. And as the bullet says here, essentially, by the September of 1916, the Allies occupy 2/3 of the German East Africa colony. Winter sets in, the weather turns bad. It's got a lot of, again, lines of communication are overstretched. They're lacking quarters. They need soldiers. Essentially, all the forces are going to kind of hunker down for the winter, and so they're going to stay where they are up until the spring of 1917. General Smuts is selected to attend the peace conference of the Allied peace discussions in England. He turns command over to a British general officer, Major General, who was universally disliked. And so about 3 months later, the British general is relieved, and another South African general, the commander of the cavalry, assumes overall command of all of the Allied forces in East Africa. By the time June rolls around, the weather has settled, resupplies are available. The Allies begin to attack VLV. And on, as it says here, by 23 November of 1917, VLV realizes he can no longer fight in this area. He picks 2,000 of his best soldiers, lets the rest of his folks disappear. And what he does is he crosses over into Portugal. So, or Portuguese East Africa, sorry. So by the 23rd of November of 1917, there are no German forces in German East Africa. It is currently occupied by the Allies. Winter sets in, winter of 1917 sets in, 1718 sets in, everyone kind of hunkers down for the winter. Again, hoping for resupply, hoping to get everyone, all their soldiers and their porters well, hoping that the roads will eventually dry up. Didn't talk about it, but one of the reasons why he wanted to go into Portugal is because he had a very low opinion of the Portuguese military, which quite frankly suffered from lack of experience, lack of supplies. And so he really moved in there. And so one of the articles I read said that the Germans chased the Portuguese and then the British chased the Germans. And so essentially for this period of time, you've got people moving all around Portuguese East Africa in an effort to attack each other. Spring finally comes, April of 1918, sorry. And so VLV decides it's time to mount an offensive. And so as you see here, he begins an attack into Nido. Fairly successfully, he chases off the Portuguese, chases off the British. He's then chased down here to Leoma in late August, where he captures that. He then moves north into Mahua. By this time, the Allied forces are kind of pulling back to see where he goes. Portuguese forces have moved down to the south. Forces in the Asalan have backed off a little bit. He decides that maybe what he needs to do is, again, make a war of movement. So he crosses back into German East Africa on 29 September, resupplies. He attacks Allied forces in Fife, which is the Asalan. And then he decides that what he wants to do is he wants to take Katub or Kasama, which is, again, a major city, railroad lines, sits on a river. There's a little bit, so it's a major communication hub. He actually occupies Kasama on the 13th of November, 2 days after the armistice was signed and declared in Europe. On the 14th, a British diplomat arrives with a telegram saying that the Kaiser has abdicated, the war is over. VLV doesn't believe him. He thinks that it's a trick to keep him from surrendering his forces. The German general now in command down here in the Asalan, he sends a note to him that essentially says the war's over, it's time for you to surrender. At which point, on the 14th or the 15th, he realizes that the war is over. He's directed to move his forces here to Abercorn and to surrender. So he moves his forces there, and on the 25th of November, 2 weeks after the armistice, he does actually surrender his forces, thus ending the war in Sub-Saharan Africa. A pause. This is the monument on the spot where the actual surrender was signed. And then here's the plaque that's up over here on this particular slide. It was interesting. VLV didn't really like the Allies. And so what he did is he had all his soldiers march over to the nearest lake and threw all of his weapons into the lake, all of the rifles, all of the machine guns, all of the artillery, because he did not want the Allies to have all of his weapons. He kept just the food and water that he needed. He then marched he wanted to train, but because of the Spanish flu pandemic, all the trains were being used for the Allies. The Allied General Edwards says, screw you, I'm not going to give you a train. So he marches his forces from northern Zambia all the way back across German East Africa to Dar es Salaam. which is where he will eventually embark and take ship back to Germany, which he is in 2019, or sorry, 2019. Check it out. Yep. So essentially, again, this is the conflict in German East Africa. I think can be categorized as a war of movement. BLV would react, the Allies would react, he would counteract, so it was back and forth, and you can see that the conflict itself stretches all across those 9 nations today. So what's my conclusion? So if you can see it, that is a proverb that comes out of Kenya. When 2 bulls fight, the grass suffers. And so, yes, it really is the Africans, I believe, who suffer the most out of this particular war, right? As it says, there's over 2 million Africans were affected. I should also point out that these are estimates because the Allied military commanders didn't really count. I took 10 people from this village, so they really don't know how many people died, how many porters died, how many laborers died, how many soldiers died. Quite frankly, it's really unknown, and the estimates run up into several million, but unsubstantiated at best. Since in East Africa, people were moving around, when the Germans came to a village, when the Allies came to the village, they almost essentially destroyed the village. They took the men and the stronger children and women, they made them quarters. They took all the food, they took the crops, they took it as food. They took all the animals, slaughtered the animals. So when the war ends and these people, these Africans want to go back home, their villages are destroyed. They have no crops. It's too late in the season to plant. The railroads have been destroyed. The roads, what little roads they've had, have been destroyed. And essentially, it's going to take decades for the economies here in Africa to recover from the beating that they got because the bulls were fighting on their continent. Spanish flu, essentially, the Spanish flu will also affect Africans as well. My notes say that anywhere between 1.5 to 15 million Africans will die of the Spanish flu. Again, accurate numbers of the population weren't known at the time, but again, it's estimated anywhere from up to 15 million. German colonies. So each of those German colonies will be given to essentially the League of Nations, but the League of Nations will then turn to either the French or the British to occupy and to administer. So Togoland will become a French colony. Cameroon is split in half. Part of it belongs to England. The other part belongs to France. When Cameroon gets its independence, the English-speaking people of Cameroon decide not to go with Nigeria when it stands up, decides to remain with Cameroon. In the last 3 or 4 years, there have been attacks by French-speaking Cameroonians against the English-speaking Cameroonians. So again, the result of the First World War all the way into modern time. And a lot of independence movements, a lot of these soldiers who maybe were promised that, hey, maybe we'll lighten up on the colonial rule when you return, all of those promises were broken. And so again, it's really not until the Second World War where African soldiers are going to become the backbone or the nucleus for a lot of the insurgencies, a lot of these movements for independence. War memorials. So this is the Commonwealth grave. This is the grave in Kenya for the soldiers. It includes both World War I and World War II. They added on to it a little bit. Here's a German memorial and German cemetery in, let's say, Zambia. Yeah, in Green, Zambia. And then down here, this is down on the right-hand corner, if you can see it, that's to the Senegalese soldiers who fought in France for the most part. All right, time for the last quiz and see if I can do it without screwing it up too bad. Again, if you can use the chat function. Was there any aha moments or was there anything that struck you as extremely interesting in this? All right, thank you, yes, appreciate that. Why did they bother to fight? Because the Allies essentially told them to be honest with you. Again, if you look at the hierarchy within each of the African colonies, being closely tied to the colonial government was a good thing. You got paid on time, you got paid a very good price. You were treated much better than the other Africans that were in that particular colony. So I can't quote it off the top of my head, but after VLV surrendered there in Zambia, his soldiers, one of his African sergeants, said that all of his soldiers would go anywhere in the world and fight for him. All he had to do was call. And so there's a tremendous amount of loyalty for a lot of the Africans as well. Yeah, it's really, like I said, we tend, had no idea that much happened. Yeah, I mean, we think a lot about what happens in Europe, but back in the halcyon days when we gave tours, and we go back to that first gallery, we remind people it was a world war. I mean, we fought in Asia, fought in Africa, fought in Latin America, fought all over that kind of stuff. Yeah, total disregard. I mean, essentially, longer discussion would be how each of these empires treat their natives or the local people. Some were very, very good. Some of them were not quite, but some of them were really totally bad. And so, but for the most part, yeah, Allied commanders, German commanders did not only think or just didn't really care about what happened, and they were just assets to be used. So yeah, so essentially, I didn't want to talk about the Brits out of Egypt into the Middle East and talk about Lawrence of Arabia and talk about Basra and all of that kind of stuff. I think that might have been discussed earlier, but it certainly would be a topic that hasn't. And Germany did not have colonies in North Africa. As Charlie said, if you remember that Germany didn't become a country really until 1871, that's when they started looking for colonies, and most of the good colonies were all taken by the British or the French or the Portuguese or the Spanish. And so, again, that was one of the reasons why they had the Berlin Conference of 84, 85. But yeah, no, the Germans did not have any colonies in North Africa. And then, how did this war help the European war? VLV essentially, one of his driving goals was to tie as much British and Allied forces as possible so that they would not be able to be shipped from Africa and fight on the Eastern Front. And so his goal was to tie up as much for as long as he could. And you can certainly say he probably treated his folks bad, but he did do that. He did tie up Allied forces for a very long time. Portugal essentially does not really become a leader in Africa. As I mentioned, through 1925, they had, in 15 years, they had 45 governments. I don't want to insult anybody who's with Portuguese extraction, but Portugal really did not do a very good job. Portugal's really had a hard time with its governments, since forever, right? So Portugal does not become a leader. You want to talk about somebody who treated their Africans really badly. When Portugal gave up their colonies in Mozambique and Angola, they destroyed everything. They broke every pane of glass. They pulled up every toilet, every urinal. They poured concrete into every sewer line. They dismantled every generator and packed it off and took it back to Portugal. Portugal did not take independence very well, or African independence very well. The Portuguese did not do a very good job, to be honest with you. All right, next slide, if I can get it working. Again, any other questions? And I think we can either use the chat function, or if you want to, we can go ahead and just ask it out right on the unmute. Go ahead and do it that way if you want. All right, okay, good. I don't want to belabor it. So some of my sources, and so for instance, the second source, and so the Portuguese War College produces, their students have to write a paper. So I found a lot of information about what Portugal's response to the war, written by Portuguese officers who were in their war college. There is a website called Academia that there's a German, where's he at? This Pesk down here at bottom left-hand corner. He's a lecturer or professor in Hamburg. He's a prolific writer about German East Africa, and he addresses all sorts of different subjects. Sorry, this Frances McNamara, she was in the British Foreign Service. She was the they don't call her. She was essentially the ambassador to Uganda. She lectures and writes about that quite a bit. And then again, a lot of different sources. Annie Sampson, I'm sorry, that Annie Sampson was the former British diplomat who writes quite a bit. And then BLV's his book there. So again, I think there in the recent, with 2014 interest in the war, centennial, and all of that, there are a lot more folks beginning to write. There really was a lack of German primary sources because all of the German authors, the repository for all of the German discussion about World War I was destroyed during World War II. Essentially, we firebombed all of that. So there was only one author who had like a 4-volume set that he kept at his house. And that at the end of 1945, at the end of the war, that was really the only primary source that was a German primary source available. And so over time now they're beginning to identify different ones as well. But again, there is a trend. If you're interested in this other subjects, other parts, there are a lot of authors out there writing about this. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk about how Africans, almost 500,000 Africans will leave Africa, travel to France, where they will be soldiers, as you see here. These are the French, these are the Senegalese soldiers. These are the North African ones. And we'll talk about that on 30 August. And thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the questions. I appreciate all of that. Again, if there are any comments or questions, I will take them at this time.
Mike, thank you very much for this presentation. You've really gone into it in great detail, and it's fascinating. It's a fascinating story, and in many ways a tragic one, because it was also pointless. They picked up a few radio stations, which I suppose were worthwhile. The one in Togoland wasn't finished at the time they captured it, and it probably wouldn't have been finished during the war. The countryside, certainly in East Africa, was devastated for a generation or more. But the whole war was a tragedy, and I guess it's sort of a bitter comment on the arrogance of Europeans that they carried that tragedy to Africa and imposed it on a continent that really didn't really have much to gain by the war, but certainly did have a lot to lose.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, essentially, the purpose of colonies is to provide natural resources. I think if they had not fought there, then all those colonies would have been able to go ahead and produce whatever it was they were producing in terms of natural resources, which then they could ship back to England, to France, not Germany, obviously, because of the blockade, but certainly as we all know, by the middle part of the war, the French could barely feed themselves because there was fighting all over their traditional cropland.